Faith like a mustard seed. You've heard it 1,000 times. Pastors preach it, greeting cards quote it, and most Christians walk away thinking Jesus was saying your faith just needs to be small. That is not what he meant. Jesus was not praising small faith. He was revealing something far more dangerous. See, we turned one of the most explosive statements Jesus ever made into a comfortable little Sunday school lesson. But when you go back to the original Greek, when you understand what a mustard seed actually was in first century Palestine, when you see what Jesus was really pointing to, faith is not size. It rewires everything you thought you knew about how God moves. The disciples had just failed publicly. They couldn't cast out a demon. They were embarrassed, confused, maybe even doubting whether Jesus had given them real authority. And in that moment of failure, Jesus doesn't comfort them. He confronts them. And what he says next has been misunderstood for 2,000 years. Until now. Let's set the scene because context changes everything. In Matthew 17, a desperate father brings his son to the disciples. The boy is suffering, tormented, throwing himself into fire and water. The father is broken. He's tried everything. And the disciples, the very men Jesus personally commissioned and gave authority to, they try to cast out the demon, and they fail. Publicly, humiliatingly. I brought him to your disciples, but they could not heal him. Imagine that moment. The crowd is watching. The religious leaders are smirking. The father is devastated. And the disciples are standing there with their hands empty and their confidence shattered. When Jesus arrives, he heals the boy instantly. No struggle, no formula, no delay. And then privately, behind closed doors, the disciples ask the question that unlocks everything. Why could we not cast it out? That question, that honest, broken, confused question, is the doorway to understanding what faith, like a mustard seed, really means. But his answer is nothing like what you'd expect. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Jesus doesn't say you failed because you didn't pray long enough. He doesn't say you need more training. He looks at his own chosen disciples and says, in the original Greek, oligopistia, your little faith, not your small faith. Your little faith. There's a difference that most translations completely miss. The Greek word oligopistia doesn't mean insufficient quantity. It means a faith that is mixed, diluted, contaminated with doubt. Mixed, diluted faith. Jesus was saying your faith is impure. You have some belief, but it's polluted with unbelief. You stepped up to that demon half believing and half doubting. And a divided faith has no authority. Think about it in your own life. How many times have you prayed while simultaneously planning what you'll do if God doesn't answer? How many times have you spoken faith with your mouth while your mind was already calculating the backup plan? If this revelation about the nature of faith is stirring something in you, hit like and subscribe for more biblical wisdom that transforms how you walk with God. Because what Jesus says next is where everything changes. Now Jesus gives them the mustard seed teaching. And this is where 2,000 years of bad interpretation has robbed the church of power. He says, if you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, you shall say to this mountain, move, and it shall move. Most people hear that and think Jesus is saying even a tiny little bit of faith is enough. That's not it. If you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. In first century Israel, the mustard seed was not famous for being small. It was famous for being unstoppable. The mustard seed was the most aggressive plant in the ancient world. Rabbis actually debated whether it should be allowed in gardens because once you planted it, nothing could stop it from growing. It took over everything. It didn't ask permission. It didn't need perfect soil conditions. It just grew and grew and grew. Jesus wasn't making a comparison about size. He was making a comparison about nature. And that distinction changes everything about how you approach God. Here's the revelation most people miss entirely. A mustard seed doesn't become the largest plant in the garden because someone helps it. It becomes the largest plant because of what's already inside it. The DNA of a tree that can grow 10 feet tall is encoded in a seed smaller than the head of a pin. The full blueprint, the complete design, the total potential, all compressed into something almost invisible. Jesus is saying your faith, when it's pure, when it's undiluted, when it's not mixed with doubt, it already contains the full power of God. Full power inside. You're not trying to build up enough faith to reach God's level. You're not trying to accumulate spiritual currency until you have enough to make a withdrawal. The moment your faith is genuine, it connects to the same omnipotent source that spoke galaxies into existence. The issue was never the amount of your faith. It was always the purity of your faith. As the Apostle James later wrote, the problem isn't small faith, it's double-mindedness. And this leads us to something even more profound. Now let's talk about the mountain, because Jesus chose that metaphor very deliberately. In Jewish literature, mountains were not just physical obstacles. They were symbols of kingdoms, powers, and systems that seemed permanent and unmovable. Who are you, great mountain? Before Zerubbabel you shall become a plain. The prophet Zechariah used the same language centuries earlier. Mountain meant empire. Mountain meant oppressive system. Mountain meant the thing in your life that seems so massive, so entrenched, so permanent that you've stopped even asking God to move it. You stopped praying about it because it felt too big to change. Maybe it's a generational pattern of addiction. Maybe it's a financial stronghold that's followed your family for decades. Maybe it's a health diagnosis that the doctors called permanent. Jesus says undiluted faith doesn't negotiate with mountains. It doesn't ask mountains to compromise. Speak and it moves. It speaks and mountains relocate. Not because the faith is large, but because the God behind the faith is infinite. But there's a piece to this puzzle that makes it even more revolutionary. There's a critical distinction hidden in the original language that most English speakers completely miss. In Greek, there are layers to what we flatten into the single word faith, and this is where religion has deceived millions. The word Jesus uses, pistis, doesn't mean intellectual agreement. It doesn't mean I believe God exists. Even demons believe God exists. James tells us that clearly. Pistis means total reliance, complete trust. The kind of trust that changes your behavior. 1, belief says God can do it. 2, faith says God will do it. 3, pistis says I'm acting as if it's already done. Think about the difference. A person can believe a chair will hold them and still stand. Faith sits down. Pistis is already sitting before they even see the chair. This is what the mustard seed represents. It doesn't hope to grow someday. It doesn't believe it might become a tree. It is already becoming what it was designed to be from the moment it touches soil. Your faith was designed to operate the same way. Not hoping, not wishing, activating. And what I'm about to show you next explains why so few Christians ever experience this. So if pure faith moves mountains, what contaminates it? James chapter 1 gives us the answer with surgical precision. A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. Double-minded, in Greek, dipsachos, literally two-souled. James says this person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord, not because God is withholding, but because a divided signal cannot connect. Dipsachos, think of it like a radio frequency. God is broadcasting on a clear channel, full power, all the time. But when your receiver is tuned to two frequencies simultaneously, all you hear is static. You're praying for healing while mentally preparing for the worst. You're declaring provision while secretly hoarding out of fear. You're confessing faith while your actions scream doubt. And the universe, the spiritual realm, responds not to your words but to your frequency. This is what contaminated the disciples' faith that day. They had authority. Jesus had given it to them. But somewhere between receiving the authority and exercising it, doubt crept in. And that's exactly what's happening in your life right now. Now let's go deeper into the botany, because Jesus knew exactly what he was doing with this metaphor. The mustard plant in ancient Palestine, known as Brassica nigra, was so aggressive that the Mishnah, the Jewish oral tradition, specifically prohibited planting it in household gardens. It was considered too invasive, too powerful, too unstoppable. One seed would take over the entire plot. It would push out every other plant. Its roots would go deeper than anything around it. Its branches would spread wider than everything nearby. And birds, Jesus specifically mentions birds, would come and nest in its shade. Invasive, unstoppable growth. Do you see the picture? Jesus is saying that authentic faith operates like a spiritual invasive species. Once it takes root in your life, it doesn't just improve one area, it takes over everything. Your finances, your relationships, your health, your purpose, your identity. It dismantles every system of fear. and rebuilds your entire reality. The religious leaders were terrified of the mustard plant for the same reason they were terrified of Jesus. Both were uncontrollable. Both disrupted the established order. Both started small and became impossible to stop. And this connects to something Jesus said that will shake you. In Matthew 13, Jesus tells another mustard seed parable. But this time he's not talking about personal faith. He's talking about the kingdom of God itself. The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. This is breathtaking when you connect the two teachings. Jesus uses the same seed to describe both your faith and his kingdom. Why? Because they operate on identical principles. The kingdom started with 12 ordinary men in an occupied territory of a global empire. No army, no political power, no institutional backing, just a seed. And within 3 centuries, that seed had conquered the empire that tried to crush it. Seed becomes empire. Your faith works the same way. It doesn't need favorable conditions. It doesn't need a supportive environment. It doesn't need the odds in its favor. The power is not in the circumstance. The power is in the seed. When Jesus tells you that your mustard seed faith can move mountains, he's telling you that the same force that toppled Rome and transformed civilization is living inside your chest right now. The question isn't whether you have enough. The question is whether you'll plant what you have. So where does this leave you? Right here, right now, with a choice. Every seed that was never planted is a forest that never existed. You've been carrying faith inside you. Maybe it feels small. Maybe it feels insignificant compared to the mountain you're facing. But after everything we've explored today, you now know the truth. It was never about the size. 1. Purify your faith. Remove the doubt mixture. 2. Speak to the mountain, not about it. 3. Act on what you believe, not what you see. 4. Trust the DNA inside the seed, not the size of the seed. The disciples failed not because they lacked faith, but because they contaminated what they had. They stood before a demon with divided hearts. But after the resurrection, after Pentecost, these same men with the same sized faith turned the world upside down. The seed did not get bigger, the soil just got purer. As the writer of Hebrews reminds us, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Faith is substance. It's not wishful thinking. It's not positive vibes. It is the raw material from which God builds your future. If you made it this far, comment mustard seed faith to show you received this truth today. Plant your seed today. Stay in the Word, stay in the Spirit, and watch what God does.